Tonight, we step into part 3 of Downton Abbey, season 2. If you remember, last time was full of hidden heartbreak. Mary and Matthew managed to say goodbye without saying what they truly meant, while Sybil surprised everyone by baking a cake, and Carson nearly had a crisis over it. This part opens in the cold hours before dawn, and the mood is aching, quietly brave, tense beneath the surface. There's a farewell at the train station that says so much more than the words spoken, and then, well, a very unwelcome visitor arrives. Wherever you are, I hope you can rest here with me. Chapter 8. The Farewell and an Unwelcome Arrival. The darkness before dawn held a quality of stillness that seemed almost sacred, as if the world were holding its breath before the inevitable resumption of war's relentless machinery. Mary Crawley moved through the sleeping village like a ghost haunting her own life, her footsteps echoing softly on cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of farewells, but none quite like this one. A plume of acrid coal smoke billowed from the first train's engine, stinging her eyes and catching in her throat. She had risen before the servants, before even the earliest kitchen maids had begun their daily preparations. The house behind her slumbered in unconscious luxury, its inhabitants safe in their beds, while she walked through the pre-dawn chill, toward a reckoning she could neither avoid nor fully understand. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and she pulled her coat closer against the bite of November wind that seemed to cut straight through to her bones. The decision to come here had been made in the sleepless hours after midnight, when the evening's careful performance had finally ended, and she could acknowledge, in the privacy of her own thoughts, the devastating reality of what Matthew's departure would mean. All the careful politeness, all the gracious acceptance of his engagement, all the perfectly calibrated displays of friendship, none of it could disguise the simple truth that she might never see him alive again. As she approached the station, she caught sight of a milkman making his early rounds, pausing to flirt with a housemaid who had emerged to collect the morning delivery. Their laughter carried through the crisp air with the particular joy of people who still believed in the permanence of small pleasures. The scene struck her as almost impossibly distant from the world of trenches and artillery barrages that would soon reclaim Matthew. Yet it reminded her of what they were all fighting to preserve. The platform was nearly deserted except for a few early travelers and the station master preparing for the day's first train. When Matthew appeared at the far end, walking with the measured pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for greater challenges ahead, Mary felt her carefully constructed composure threaten to crumble entirely. He stopped when he saw her, his surprise evident in the slight hesitation of his step and the way his hand moved automatically to straighten his uniform jacket. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the space that separated them. Two people who had shared so much, yet remained fundamentally apart. "Don't worry," Mary said quickly, recognizing the uncertainty in his expression. "I haven't come to undo your good work of the other night." The words were chosen to reassure him, to make it clear that she had no intention of creating a scene or making demands that might complicate his already difficult situation. But beneath their surface, politeness lay layers of meaning that only he would fully comprehend. "You must have been up before the servants," Matthew observed, moving closer with the particular caution of someone navigating through emotional territory fraught with hidden dangers. "They were rather surprised to see me," Mary admitted. allowing herself a small smile at the memory of Carson's barely concealed shock at finding her fully dressed and demanding to use the motor car at such an unprecedented hour. She reached into her bag with movements that betrayed none of the nervous tension that gripped her. "I wanted to give you this." The object she held out was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, a toy that had clearly seen years of devoted attention. Its fur was worn smooth in places, one ear was slightly torn, and the overall effect was of something that had been loved beyond all reason or proportion. "It's my lucky charm," she explained, her voice carefully controlled, despite the magnitude of what she was offering. "I've had it always, so you must promise to bring it back without a scratch." Matthew took the small toy with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred relic. The weight of it in his hands seemed to carry far more significance than its modest size would suggest. This was not simply a good luck token, but a piece of Mary's childhood, a tangible connection to the person she had been before the world became complicated by expectations and disappointments. "Won't you need it?" he asked, though his fingers had already closed protectively around the small figure. "Not as much as you," Mary replied, her voice carrying just enough tremor to reveal the depth of emotion she was working so hard to conceal. "So look after it, please." The simple request carried the weight of everything she could not say directly. "Look after yourself. Come back safely. Remember that someone here cares whether you live or die." The toy would serve as a tangible reminder of home, of the life that waited for him beyond the nightmare of the Western Front. "I'll try not to be a hero, if that's what you're afraid of," Matthew said softly, understanding perfectly the subtext of her gift. "Just come back, safe and sound," Mary said, abandoning all pretense at casual conversation. "Did you have a happy time yesterday?" The question was safe enough, the sort of polite inquiry that anyone might make. Yet it carried depths of personal interest that transformed it into something far more intimate. She was asking whether his return to Downton had brought him pleasure or pain, whether the connections he had maintained here were worth preserving. "I showed Lavinia the places I like most," Matthew replied carefully, "to give her a few memories." The words struck Mary like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression unchanged. Here was the confirmation of what she had most feared, that Matthew was not simply engaged to Lavinia, but was actively working to build a life with her, to create the foundation for a future that would have no place for the complicated emotions that still existed between them. "Mary, if I don't come back," Matthew began, his voice taking on the particular urgency of someone who understood that certain things must be said while the opportunity still existed. "But," Mary started to protest, unable to bear the direction this conversation was taking. "No, if I don't, then do remember how very glad I am that we made up when we had the chance. I mean it. You send me off to war a happy man." The declaration was both gift and burden, offering her the comfort of knowing that their reconciliation had brought him peace while simultaneously emphasizing the finality of his departure. He was telling her that this moment represented completion rather than beginning, resolution rather than hope. Matthew's next request required even greater courage than his previous admission. "Will you do something for me? Will you look after Mother if anything happens?" "Of course we will, but it won't," Mary replied automatically, though they both understood that such assurances were based on hope rather than certainty. "And Lavinia?" The name hung in the air between them like an accusation. She's young, and she'll find someone else. I hope she does anyway. But until she does... The request was almost unbearably difficult to make, and equally challenging to receive. Matthew was asking Mary to care for the woman who had taken her place, to offer friendship and support to someone who represented everything she had lost. Yet, beneath the surface of this impossible demand lay something else, the acknowledgement that Lavinia was, in some sense, a placeholder rather than an irreplaceable love. Mary was saved from having to respond by the distant whistle of an approaching locomotive. The sound cut through the morning air, announcing the arrival of the train that would carry Matthew back to France and whatever fate awaited him there. "That's my train," Matthew said, though neither of them moved immediately toward the platform. Instead, they reached for each other with the careful deliberation of people who understood that this physical contact might be their last. Mary kissed his cheek with a tenderness that spoke of everything they had shared and everything they were losing, while Matthew's hands found hers with the desperate gratitude of someone receiving absolution. "Goodbye, then," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And such good luck." "Goodbye, Mary, and God bless you." The words carried the weight of prayer, the desperate hope that whatever powers governed the universe might show mercy to someone who had already endured more than her share of disappointment. As Matthew turned toward the waiting train, Mary watched his retreating figure with the particular intensity of someone trying to memorize details that might have to last a lifetime. The locomotive hissed and steamed with mechanical impatience as Matthew climbed aboard. Through the window, she could see him settling into his seat, his face already taking on the distant expression of someone mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. The guard's whistle pierced the morning air, and the great machine lurched into motion with the inexorable momentum of industrial progress. As the train gathered speed, Mary remained on the platform, a solitary figure watching the carriages accelerate into the distance. When the final car had disappeared, the sound of the engine faded, leaving behind only the awakening village and the echo of her own breathing in the suddenly empty space. It was only then, in the profound silence that followed, that she became aware of another presence. A woman had alighted from the same train that had carried Matthew away, a figure that seemed to materialize from the morning shadows, like something conjured from Mary's own fears. The woman was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back severely, and a face that spoke of experiences that had left their mark in lines around her eyes and mouth. Her clothing was respectable but worn, suggesting someone who maintained appearances through careful management rather than abundant resources. There was something predatory in her bearing, a watchfulness that marked her as someone who had learned to survive by being alert to opportunity and weakness in equal measure. As she passed Mary on her way toward the village, their eyes met briefly. The stranger's gaze was calculating, measuring, as if she were taking inventory of Mary's worth and vulnerability in a single glance. There was no recognition in that look, but there was assessment, the professional evaluation of someone who had learned to read people as a matter of survival. Mary watched the woman disappear into the early morning streets of Downton Village, her heart seized by an inexplicable sense of foreboding. The peaceful conclusion of Matthew's visit had been shattered by this unexpected arrival. Vera Bates had come to Downton, and with her, the careful equilibrium that had sustained them all through the war's early years was about to be shattered completely. The morning light was growing stronger now, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. But for Mary, the future had never seemed more uncertain or more fraught with the potential for loss. Later that afternoon, as a sense of unease settled over the household, Cora found herself summoned from the library by a conspiratorial Carson. His face wore an expression of grave disapproval, a look he usually reserved for a serious breach in the polishing of the silver or the arrival of an uninvited guest. "I'm sorry to trouble you, milady," he began, his voice a low rumble of discontent. "But something's been going on, and I don't feel quite easy that you've not been made aware of it." "Goodness, Carson, what is this dark secret?" Cora asked, a flicker of amusement mixing with her curiosity. "Lady Sybil has spent the last 2 days in the kitchens," he announced, as though confessing to a murder in the drawing room. "She asked Mistress Patmore for some cooking lessons because of this nursing course." Cora's surprise was genuine. I wondered where she'd been hiding, but why didn't she mention it? Carson leaned in, guiding her toward the internal passage window that overlooked the main kitchen. "It seems she's made a cake for your ladyship, as a surprise. But I'm uneasy with surprises at the best of times, and I wonder if the whole exercise is entirely appropriate." Cora peered through the small glass pane. Below, the kitchen was a hive of nervous excitement. A group of kitchen maids, including Daisy and a still defiant Ethel, were gathered around the main stove in a tight, supportive circle. At the center of it all was Sybil, her face flushed from the heat, a smudge of flour on her cheek, her concentration absolute as she prepared to turn out her creation. She was not Lady Sybil Crawley, daughter of the Earl. She was simply Sybil, a young woman hoping her first baking attempt was not a disaster. The energy was infectious. The girls whispered encouragement, their faces alight with a shared sense of purpose and camaraderie. "Ta-da!" Sybil cried with a triumphant flourish as the cake tumbled from its tin, perfect and golden. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the kitchen maids. They clapped and laughed, gathering around Sybil, all hierarchies forgotten as they admired her handiwork. It was a perfect, unguarded moment of simple joy. Carson, beside her, cleared his throat disapprovingly. "I'm not comfortable with this, milady. Not comfortable at all." But Cora wasn't listening. She was seeing her daughter with new eyes. All her fears about the nursing course, the horrors she would see, the dangers she would face, the coarsening of her gentle spirit, suddenly seemed misplaced. What she saw through the window was not a fragile aristocrat in peril, but a vibrant young woman, independent and capable, finding a joyful camaraderie in a world her mother had never known. She was not being diminished by this experience. She was being forged by it. A profound sense of peace settled over Cora. "They're just girls, Carson," she whispered, her voice soft with revelation. "Just young girls, all on the brink of the rest of their lives." She turned from the window, a genuine smile replacing the worried frown she had worn all day. "I was worried about Lady Sybil, but now I'm not worried anymore." She started up the stairs, leaving the butler utterly puzzled by her response. Then she paused, turning back to him with a conspiratorial whisper. "And Carson, the cake will be a surprise, whether you approve or not, so please don't give me away." Chapter 9. The Price of Freedom. The servants' hall at Downton Abbey had always been a sanctuary where hierarchies softened and genuine human relationships could flourish beyond the watchful eyes of their employers. But this morning, a new and unfamiliar current of tension had entered the familiar space. Anna moved through her duties with a sense of quiet foreboding, her focus continually drawn to the stranger who sat at the long table, a woman whose presence felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. Ethel sat at the long table, her magazine spread before her, as she attempted to lose herself in stories of distant glamour and unlikely transformations. But her attention was clearly divided. Part of her awareness focused on the stranger who had appeared among them like a harbinger of complications they were not prepared to handle. The woman introduced herself as Vera Bates, with the casual confidence of someone who expected her presence to be accepted without question. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with the sort of strong features that spoke of character forged in difficult circumstances. Her dark hair was pulled back with severe precision, and her clothing, while respectable, carried the particular shabbiness that came from being maintained through careful economy rather than regular replacement. But it was her eyes that marked her as dangerous, intelligent, calculating, and hardened by experiences that had taught her to view the world as a place where advantage must be seized whenever opportunity presented itself. When she smiled, which she did often during her conversation with Ethel, the expression never quite reached those eyes, leaving the distinct impression that she was performing rather than genuinely enjoying herself. Lady Mary was very much a part of the story, I assure you, Vera was saying, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who possessed information that others would prefer to keep hidden. Anna paused in the doorway, every instinct warning her that she was witnessing something that would have far-reaching consequences. The casual mention of Lady Mary's name in connection with some unspecified story sent alarm bells clanging through her mind. "But how do you know?" Ethel asked with the innocence of someone who had not yet learned to recognize the signs of potential catastrophe. "Well, you see, I worked for Lady Flintshire," Vera began, but Anna's entrance interrupted the flow of whatever revelation she had been preparing to share. "Ethel, I hope you've offered our visitor some tea," Anna said, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from years of managing social situations that required delicate handling. The interruption was deliberate, designed to give Anna time to assess this unexpected development and determine how much damage had already been done. Ethel's eager agreement to fetch refreshments provided the opportunity for a private conversation that Anna desperately needed. In the kitchen passage, away from Vera's sharp ears, Anna seized Ethel's arm with more force than she had intended. "What is the first law of service? We do not discuss the business of this house with strangers." But Ethel's response carried the devastating simplicity of someone who saw no reason for such concern. "But she's not a stranger. She's Mr. Bates's wife." The words hit Anna like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and sending her carefully constructed world spinning into chaos. This woman, this hard-faced stranger with her calculating eyes and her casual references to dangerous secrets, was the legal obstacle that stood between Anna and everything she had dared to hope for. When they returned to the servants' hall, Anna found herself studying Vera with new eyes, searching for some sign of the woman who had once inspired love in the man she cherished above all others. But what she saw instead was someone who had been shaped by disappointment and hardship into something altogether more formidable and considerably more dangerous. "So, you're Anna," Vera said, her voice carrying a note of assessment that made Anna feel like livestock being evaluated at market. "I am," Anna replied, struggling to maintain her composure in the face of this unexpected confrontation. "You're the one who went to call on my late, lamented mother-in-law," Vera continued, each word precisely chosen for maximum impact. The reference to Anna's visit to London, a journey that had been undertaken with such hope and had ended with such promise, now felt like evidence of naivety that bordered on criminal stupidity. How had she failed to anticipate that Vera would discover her interference? How had she imagined that such a woman would simply accept the loss of her financial leverage without attempting to reclaim it? "Yes, I did," Anna admitted, though every instinct warned her that honesty might prove to be a luxury she could not afford. "I know you did," Vera said, with the satisfaction of someone delivering a checkmate in a game her opponent had not realized they were playing. The arrival of Bates in the doorway provided a temporary reprieve from this increasingly uncomfortable exchange. His face registered no surprise at finding his wife in the servants' hall of Downton Abbey, which suggested either remarkable self-control or advanced knowledge of her arrival. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting, Vera," he said, with the careful politeness of someone navigating through a minefield. "I was up in the attics, sorting out some cupboards." Vera's response carried the particular sweetness that marked her most dangerous moods. "Don't worry, I've been having a nice time here with Ethel and Miss Smith." Mistress Hughes appeared with the diplomatic precision of someone who understood that this situation required careful management. Her suggestion that the couple might prefer privacy for their reunion was both thoughtful and strategic, removing them from the curious ears of the other servants while providing a controlled environment for whatever negotiations were about to unfold. "That's very thoughtful," Bates agreed, though his voice suggested he would have preferred to conduct this conversation anywhere but within the walls of Downton Abbey. "It is," Vera replied with syrupy agreement. "But then you're all so kind. I'm beginning to understand why my Bateses got so spoiled." The casual possessiveness of her tone, combined with the infantilizing nickname, created an atmosphere of such profound discomfort that even Ethel seemed to recognize that she was witnessing something deeply unpleasant. Mistress Hughes's sitting room had always been a place of refuge and reasonable conversation, where problems could be discussed with frankness, and solutions could be found through the application of common sense and goodwill. But today, the familiar space felt transformed into something approaching an interrogation chamber, where two people who had once shared the most intimate of relationships now faced each other as adversaries in a war that could have only one victor. Vera moved about the room with the casual confidence of someone conducting a thorough inspection, her eyes taking inventory of every detail as if calculating the value of what she observed. She poured milk into her teacup with movements that spoke of someone savoring the luxury of being served rather than serving, someone who intended to extract maximum pleasure from this temporary elevation in her circumstances. Bates remained standing by the window, his posture rigid with the particular tension of someone who had learned to expect the worst from life, yet still found himself unprepared for the depths to which human cruelty could descend. The afternoon light that filtered through the glass cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the lines that years of disappointment had etched around his eyes. "Sit down," Vera commanded with the casual authority of someone who had learned to use domestic intimacy as a weapon. "I don't want to sit down," Bates replied, his voice carrying the stubborn resistance of someone who understood that even small gestures of compliance could lead to larger surrenders. Vera's smile in response was both understanding and predatory. She settled herself more comfortably in her chair, clearly prepared to enjoy what promised to be a lengthy and entertaining confrontation. "Suit yourself," she said, taking a delicate sip of her tea before launching into the assault she'd been planning since the moment she learned of his changed circumstances. "Look, I'm not saying it's all your fault for how things were between us," Bates began, with the desperate reasonableness of someone hoping that logic might yet prevail over malice. "But I couldn't go back to that. I'll take the blame. I'll go to some hotel in Malton with a tart. So why hold on?" The offer was both pathetic and touching, the gesture of a man so desperate for freedom that he was willing to provide his wife with grounds for divorce, regardless of the cost to his own reputation. But Vera's response made it clear that conventional solutions would not satisfy her particular appetite for revenge. "Because I've tried it on my own and I don't like it," she said, with the simple directness of someone stating an obvious fact. "You've got money now. We'll be comfortable." The casual assumption that his inheritance automatically became her property revealed the depth of her sense of entitlement and the futility of any appeal to her better nature. This was not a woman who could be reasoned with or bought off with conventional settlements. "You're out of your mind," Bates exploded with the particular fury of someone who had maintained careful control for too long. "What makes you think that I'd ever let it happen?" Vera's response was delivered with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment of resistance. "You went to prison for me once." The reference to his previous sacrifice hung in the air between them like a poison cloud, reminding him that his own sense of honor had already been used against him once and could easily be weaponized again. But worse was yet to come. "I must say this is very good," Vera continued, taking another deliberate sip of her tea. "Does Lord Grantham have his own blend?" The casual shift to domestic pleasantries, while discussing the destruction of his life, revealed a particular form of cruelty that was both sophisticated and deeply personal. She was demonstrating her ability to destroy everything he valued while maintaining the facade of polite conversation. "Is that all?" Bates asked, though his voice suggested he already knew that the worst was yet to come. "Not quite. You see, if you don't come back to me, I'm going to the newspapers with a cracking story, and I'd like to bet the Granthams won't survive it." The threat fell into the room like a physical weight, crushing any remaining hope that this confrontation might be resolved through reasonable negotiation. Bates felt his world contracting around him as he began to understand the true dimensions of the trap that had been constructed around his happiness. "Oh, and what nonsense is this?" he managed to ask, though every instinct warned him that the answer would be devastating. "The nonsense I heard when I used your name to get a job with Lady Flintshire, his lordship's cousin," Vera replied, with the particular pleasure of someone savoring a long-anticipated revelation. The connection to the family through Lady Flintshire explained how Vera had gained access to information that should have remained private, how servants' gossip had provided her with ammunition that could destroy lives with surgical precision. "Well, when I arrived, Her maid asked if it was true about Lady Mary Crawley and the Turkish diplomat. Vera continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had discovered a treasure trove of destructive potential. They thought I'd know, you see, being your wife. The mention of the Turkish diplomat sent ice through Bates's veins. The Pamuk scandal was exactly the sort of story that could destroy not just Mary's reputation, but the entire family's standing in society. In an age when a woman's virtue was considered the foundation of her value, such a revelation could render Mary unmarriageable and bring shame upon everyone connected to the Crawley name. I hope you told them you knew nothing about it, Bates said, though his voice betrayed his growing desperation. As if, Vera replied with casual brutality. I said, "Why don't you tell me what you think you know, and I'll tell you if it's true." The admission that she had actively encouraged the circulation of destructive gossip revealed the depths of her malice and the sophistication of her revenge. This was not simply about reclaiming her husband, but about punishing everyone who had contributed to her current unhappiness. Goodness me, wasn't my patience rewarded? Vera continued with evident satisfaction. The public's bored with the war, you see. They like gossip and a diplomat dying in the bed of an earl's unmarried daughter. Well, that takes the ticket for the tale of the year. The casual assessment of public appetite for scandal revealed how thoroughly she had thought through her strategy. This was not an impulsive threat, but a carefully calculated assault designed to achieve maximum damage. It's a pack of lies, Bates said weakly, though they both knew that the truth was irrelevant when measured against the power of a well-crafted scandal. I assume that's loyalty and not ignorance, Vera asked with mock concern. Because, you see, I heard Lady Mary needed her maid to help carry him. And, yes, you've guessed it, your precious Anna's going to figure in the story too. Not to worry too much. It isn't a criminal offense, is it? Just a social one. The inclusion of Anna in the threatened exposure was the final, most exquisite twist of the knife. Vera understood perfectly that destroying Anna along with Mary would multiply Bates's anguish exponentially. This was revenge crafted with surgical precision, designed to cause maximum suffering to everyone he cared about. For a moment, Bates was still, his mind racing through the impossible arithmetic of the situation before him. Then rage overcame restraint, and he lurched toward her with his hand raised to strike. "You bitch!" The word tore from his throat like the cry of a wounded animal, but Vera held her ground with the calm confidence of someone who had anticipated exactly this reaction. "Please, be my guest. But then you must excuse me while I run into town and have it photographed." The threat to document any physical assault revealed the completeness of her preparation and the futility of any response based on emotion rather than calculation. She had thought through every possible reaction and prepared countermeasures designed to turn his own decency against him. Bates sank back against the wall in despair, understanding at last the true dimensions of the trap that had been constructed around him. "What do you want from me?" The question represented complete surrender, the acknowledgement that he was powerless against the combination of his own principles and her absolute lack of them. "Firstly, hand in your notice. Tonight, I'll put up at the pub in the village," Vera said, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been planning this conversation for months. "What reason do I give?" Bates asked, though his voice suggested he was already resigned to compliance. "You don't need a reason. Just tell them that you're going, and then tomorrow we head back to London. We'll stay in your mother's house for the time being, till we get ourselves sorted." As Vera outlined her terms with the casual authority of someone dictating the conditions of surrender, neither of them noticed the small grating in the wall that connected this room to the adjacent passage. But Mistress Hughes, positioned carefully on the other side, heard every word of the conversation that was unfolding within her own sanctuary. The housekeeper's face registered a mixture of horror and determination as she absorbed the full implications of what Vera was threatening. Here was blackmail in its purest form, the weaponization of scandal against people whose only crime was existing in a world where reputation mattered more than truth. And in case you're wondering, Vera's voice continued through the grating, "Whatever my future plans may be, they all involve you." Mistress Hughes remained motionless in the passage, understanding that she had just witnessed the destruction of multiple lives, and that the knowledge she now possessed carried its own burden of responsibility. The question was no longer whether Bates would be forced to leave Downton, but whether anything could be done to prevent the complete catastrophe that Vera's presence threatened to unleash upon everyone they all held dear. The drawing room at Crawley House was, on the surface, an oasis of civilized calm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. The scent of Darjeeling tea and lemon cake hung sweetly, and porcelain cups clinked with quiet decorum. Yet beneath the placid surface, a battle of wills was being waged, as fierce as any conflict on the continent. At the center of it was Violet, holding court with the unshakable confidence of a monarch on her own throne. Across from her, Isabel's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white with a barely suppressed moral outrage. Between them, Dr. Clarkson looked deeply uncomfortable, while Molesley hovered nervously, a pawn in a game between two queens. Violet had been outlining her entirely practical, entirely unscrupulous plan to protect the local men she deemed essential. She turned her gaze upon Molesley, not with a question, but with a demand for agreement disguised as one. "It would be a terrible thing if poor old Mr. Molesley's son were killed," she stated, her voice as smooth as polished jade. "Wouldn't it, Molesley?" The butler, trapped, could only manage a slight, miserable nod. He was a piece being moved on a chessboard, acutely aware of his own powerlessness. Isabel could remain silent no longer. The casual deployment of class and influence to subvert the rules that sent other women's sons to their deaths was more than she could stomach. "I don't want my own son to die either," she said, her voice trembling with a passion she refused to conceal. "But this is a war, and we must be in it together, high and low, rich and poor. There can be no special cases, because every man at the front is a special case to someone." The declaration, born of a fierce and modern sense of fairness, hung in the air, a direct challenge to the centuries of aristocratic privilege Violet embodied. Dr. Clarkson shifted in his seat. He had been placed in an impossible professional and ethical position, asked by a dowager countess to bend the truth for men she favored. He saw the fire in Isabel's eyes and knew where his duty lay. "Mistress Crawley is right," he said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "I understand your motives, Lady Grantham, and I do not criticize them, but I shall write to the ministry at once correcting the misinformation. Good day." He rose and saw himself out, leaving an awkward, charged trio in his wake. Violet fixed Isabel with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "But they'll get you in the end, Molesley. she said, rising from her chair with regal stiffness. She did not look at Isabel as she delivered her final, devastating shot. And you can blame Mistress Crawley when they do. She swept from the room, leaving behind a silence thick with the fallout of a war fought not with guns, but with principles. Chapter 10. The Cost of Honor. The master's dressing room at Downton Abbey had always been a sanctuary of masculine routine and comfortable tradition. But tonight, the familiar space felt charged with an atmosphere of betrayal and incomprehension that transformed the evening ritual of preparation into something approaching an interrogation. Robert stood before his mirror in evening dress, his face flushed with an anger that seemed to radiate from every line of his body. What do you mean? You can't suddenly jump ship like a sailor on a spree. His voice carried the particular fury of someone whose fundamental assumptions about loyalty and human nature had just been shattered without warning or explanation. Bates stood with the rigid posture of a soldier facing court-martial, his face a mask of careful neutrality that revealed nothing of the agony churning beneath the surface. Every instinct screamed at him to explain, to justify, to make his lordship understand that this decision was being forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. But Vera's threats echoed in his mind with perfect clarity, and he knew that the truth would only multiply the damage exponentially. "I'm very sorry, my lord," he began, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. "So you bloody well should be." Robert's interruption came with the force of genuine hurt masquerading as anger. "What about Anna? What does she say to this change of plan?" The mention of Anna's name was like a physical blow, reminding Bates of everything he was sacrificing and everyone he was failing in his desperate attempt to protect those he loved most. "I haven't spoken to her yet." "Well, don't you think you should?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the implications that Bates could not explain. Robert's bewilderment was genuine and painful to witness. Here was a man who had built his entire worldview around concepts of loyalty and mutual obligation, only to discover that someone he had trusted implicitly was apparently willing to abandon everything without explanation or apology. "Bates, when you first came here, I fought to keep you," Robert continued, his voice breaking slightly, as he recalled the battles he had waged on behalf of someone who now seemed unworthy of such efforts. "Everyone was against me, everyone from her ladyship to Carson. They thought I was mad. But I said to them, after all that we've been through together, Bates and I owe him my loyalty." Each word struck Bates like a hammer blow, driving home the magnitude of what he was being forced to destroy. Robert's faith in him had been absolute, and now he was repaying that trust with what appeared to be callous abandonment. The irony was almost unbearable. In trying to protect his lordship's family, he was breaking the heart of the man who had shown him nothing but kindness and understanding. "I appreciate that, my lord, but what? But loyalty doesn't matter to you." The accusation cut deeper than any physical wound could have done. Loyalty was the foundation of Bates's entire moral universe, the principle that had governed every significant decision of his adult life. To be accused of lacking it by the man whose loyalty he was desperately trying to preserve felt like the cruelest irony imaginable. "It does matter, my lord. Not enough to make you change your mind. Not even enough to make you stay until I've found a replacement." Robert's hurt was transforming into something uglier now, disappointment curdling into contempt as he struggled to make sense of what seemed like inexplicable selfishness from someone he had considered almost a son. "I can't," Bates said simply, though the words contained volumes of anguish that he could never express. "You won't take any more money off me. You leave empty-handed." The accusation stung because it revealed how completely Robert misunderstood the situation. This was not about money or advancement or any of the petty motivations that might drive ordinary servants to seek better positions. This was about sacrifice on a scale that Robert could never comprehend because Bates could never explain it. "I don't want money, my lord." The quiet dignity of his response seemed to penetrate Robert's anger, reminding him that whatever else might be true, Bates had never shown the slightest interest in material gain. The realization shamed him slightly, enough to produce something approaching an apology. "I'm sorry, Bates. That was a low shot. Of course you can have whatever is owing to you." But the damage had been done, and both men understood that this conversation had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. Robert's final words carried the weight of absolute finality. "I thought we were friends, that's all. I thought we had crossed the great divide, successfully. Well, I've had my say. It's your life. But you've disappointed me, Bates. I cannot remember being more disappointed in any man." The condemnation hit Bates with devastating force because it was so completely undeserved, yet so utterly unavoidable. He had indeed crossed the great divide that separated master from servant, had been welcomed into something approaching familial affection, only to be forced to throw it all away to protect the very people who would never understand the sacrifice he was making. The kitchen courtyard had been the site of their greatest happiness just days before, the place where they had planned a future that had seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Now it felt like a place of execution, where everything beautiful in Bates's life would be systematically destroyed by his own apparent choices. Anna stood with her back to the stone wall, her face a mask of incomprehension and growing anger. She had loved him absolutely, had offered him everything she possessed, and now he was discarding it all with explanations that made no sense, and justifications that rang hollow. "I'm not believing it," she said, her voice rising with the particular fury of someone who felt their intelligence was being insulted. "You say my life is over, and your wife will collect you first thing, and that's it? Have you mentioned this to anyone else?" "Only Mr. Carson and Mistress Hughes," Bates replied mechanically. "The others can find out when I've gone." But Anna possessed too much intelligence and too much understanding of his character to accept such explanations at face value. Something fundamental was missing from his account, some crucial piece of information that would make sense of this apparent madness. "I know you've not told me the real reason," she said with the certainty of someone who had learned to read him like an open book. The accusation hung between them like a challenge, and for a moment Bates wavered. Every fiber of his being wanted to tell her the truth, to explain that he was not abandoning her, but protecting her, that this sacrifice was the deepest expression of his love rather than its negation. But Vera's threats echoed in his mind with perfect clarity, and he forced himself to maintain the fiction that was destroying them both. "You're wrong. Vera has reminded me that I'm a married man, that I must give my vows another chance. I had no right to involve you in my life." The lies tasted like poison in his mouth, but they were necessary lies, the only shield he could offer against the storm that Vera threatened to unleash. Anna's response revealed that she saw through his deception, even if she could not understand its true purpose. Yes, but you see, that's just what I don't agree with. You had every right. You had the right of a suffering prisoner fighting for freedom. But I know you. You're doing something gallant here, making a sacrifice for my honor. But I don't want you to. Her words revealed the depth of her understanding and the magnitude of her love. She grasped instinctively that his apparent cruelty masked some form of protection, even if she could not comprehend its exact nature. Her next declaration came with the force of absolute conviction. I don't care. Don't you understand? I don't care what people say. I'd live in sin with you. I would. I'd rather stand naked in the full light of day on top of Nelson's column than let you go. The offer was extraordinary in its scope and courage. For a woman of her time and class to propose such a thing represented a complete abandonment of everything that had been taught to define her worth and respectability. She was offering to become a social outcast for his sake, to sacrifice her reputation and her family's standing for the sake of their love. But this only made Bates's position more impossible. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for him only emphasized how much he stood to lose by accepting Vera's terms, yet also how much more Anna would lose if he refused them. The mathematics of love and destruction were impossibly complex, and there was no solution that did not involve devastating someone he cherished. I can't, he whispered, his voice breaking under the strain of maintaining the pretense. If she's threatening to ruin me, then let her. It's nothing to me. The only ruin that I recognize is to be without you. Anna's fierce declaration revealed the core truth of their relationship, that for her, social disgrace was nothing compared to the loss of genuine love. But she could not understand that Vera's threats extended far beyond her own reputation to encompass the entire family that had become their world. Bates reached up to stroke her cheek with infinite tenderness, knowing this might be his last opportunity to touch her face or convey any portion of the love that was consuming him from within. Forget me and be happy. Please. I couldn't. Not ever. You should and you must. I am nothing. With those final words, he turned and walked into the house without looking back, knowing that any hesitation would destroy his resolve entirely. Behind him, Anna stood alone in the courtyard where they had planned their future, surrounded by the wreckage of everything they had dared to hope for. In a Yorkshire mess, honor was a fragile thing, a title given and then stripped of meaning, leaving a man like Robert feeling like a hollow fraud. But 300 miles away, in the blood-soaked earth of France, honor was something else entirely. It was a tangible commodity, to be seized and wielded with desperate intelligence. For men like Thomas Barrow, the only honor that mattered now was the honor of seeing another sunrise, and he knew you didn't wait for it to be bestowed. You made your own bloody luck. The departure of Lady Sybil from Downton Abbey carried a significance that extended far beyond the simple fact of one young woman leaving home to pursue her education. As she stood beside the motor car with her modest luggage, she represented something revolutionary, the transformation of an ornamental aristocrat into a working woman, the crossing of boundaries that had seemed permanent and impermeable just a few years before. The family had gathered to see her off with the particular mixture of pride and apprehension that marked all such moments of transition. Cora's tears were barely held in check, while Robert maintained the stiff upper lip that his breeding demanded even as his eyes betrayed his emotion. But it was her conversation with Branson that carried the deepest implications for the future. As he prepared to drive her to her new life, their exchange carried undercurrents of emotion and possibility that both acknowledged and neither was quite prepared to address directly. "Be hard to let you go," Sybil said softly, not quite realizing how her words might be interpreted. "My last link with home?" "Not as hard as it is for me," Branson replied with an intensity that made her understand, too late, what territory she had inadvertently entered. The conversation that followed was painful in its honesty and impossible in its implications. Branson's declaration of love was both brave and hopeless, a crossing of social boundaries that could lead nowhere but disappointment. Yet there was something in Sybil's response that suggested the old certainties were beginning to crack, that the war was indeed changing everything in ways that none of them had anticipated. That same evening, the officers' mess of the London, Scottish, and Yorkshire was a world away from the mud and chaos of the front. Here, civilization stubbornly persisted. Regimental silver gleamed under the soft glow of gas lamps, the mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the rich scarlet and gold of the men's formal mess kits. The air was thick with the scent of fine cigars and older port, a masculine haze of tradition and camaraderie. For Robert, sitting amongst them, it felt like coming home. The easy banter, the shared history, the unspoken code of conduct. This was the world he understood, the world in which he had been forged. For the first time in months, the gnawing sense of his own irrelevance had faded. Here, in this uniform, amongst these men, he felt he finally belonged. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the port in his glass, and turned to the general beside him, a man of his own vintage, with eyes that had seen more than one kind of war. Robert felt a sudden, pressing need to make the man understand the profound significance of this evening. "I cannot tell you how pleased I am to be here tonight, sir," Robert began, his voice thick with a genuine emotion that was rare for him. "You see, just to know I'm with you all, to sense that I belong here, well, it's as simple as this. I no longer feel like a fraud." The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. The general smiled, a kind, paternal expression that held a trace of pity Robert did not at first recognize. He paused for a moment before he spoke, clearly choosing his words with care. "Oh, my dear fellow," he said, his voice gentle, but the words themselves a catastrophic blow. "We're not as heartless as that. The position is only an honorary one. Nobody expects you to go to war." The world seemed to stop. The comforting murmur of conversation faded to a distant buzz. The fine port in his glass suddenly tasted like ash, the cigar smoke acrid in his lungs. Honorary. The word was a death sentence to the hope he had so carefully nurtured. A meaningless title, a decorative position for an old codger to keep spirits high at home. "An honorary one," Robert repeated, his own voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "We thought it'd cheer things up a bit to have the Lord Lieutenant at our table. And so it does," the general continued, oblivious to the devastation he had just wrought. "But we old codgers have our work cut out for us keeping spirits high at home. Someone must." Robert managed a nod, a stiff, mechanical gesture. "Indeed, sir." He brought the cigar to his lips, but his hand was trembling. The feeling of belonging, the sense of restored purpose had vanished, replaced by a humiliation so profound it was almost physical. He was not a soldier. He was a museum piece, brought out for display to make the real men feel better. The scarlet and gold of his uniform suddenly felt like a jester's motley. He was, and always would be, a fraud. Far from the domestic dramas of Yorkshire, the Western Front continued its relentless consumption of human life with mechanical efficiency. In a first aid post that had been carved from the mud and reinforced with salvaged timber, two men from vastly different backgrounds found themselves sharing tea and temporary refuge from the endless violence that surrounded them. Matthew Crawley and Thomas Barrow sat in the flickering light of a paraffin lamp, their conversation marking a revolution in social relations that would have been unthinkable before the war. Here, in this place where death made equals of everyone, the careful hierarchies of English society seemed not just irrelevant, but actively absurd. "That's nectar," Matthew said, savoring the sweet tea that Thomas had somehow procured through the mysterious supply networks that kept the front lines functioning. "Are you sure you can spare it?" "Gladly, if we can talk about the old days and forget about all this for a minute or two," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who had seen too much and understood too clearly the nature of what they were all caught up in. Their conversation meandered through memories of Downton, updates on family and staff, and the kind of ordinary gossip that seemed impossibly precious in this place, where ordinary life had been suspended indefinitely. For a few minutes, they were simply two Englishmen sharing stories of home, their different origins rendered meaningless by their shared humanity. "I wonder if we'll go back to the way things were when the war is over," Matthew mused, voicing the question that haunted everyone who had lived through this transformation. "What do you think?" "To be honest, I doubt it," Thomas replied, with the clarity of someone who had no investment in preserving the old arrangements. The conversation continued for a while longer, touching on hopes and fears, and the impossible challenge of imagining a future that bore any resemblance to the past they had known. When Matthew finally departed, Thomas sat alone with his tea and his thoughts, contemplating the vast gulf that separated this muddy hole from the civilized world that had created it. As if summoned by his contemplation, a fellow stretcher-bearer approached with the casual camaraderie that marked relationships forged under fire. "Where are you going?" the man asked, as Thomas stood and began moving toward the forward positions. "Never you mind," Thomas replied, with the particular determination of someone who had reached a decision that brooked no argument. He walked through the maze of trenches with purpose now, checking carefully to ensure he was unobserved, before stopping at a position that offered him the opportunity he needed. The constant noise of gunfire provided cover for what he was about to do, while the darkness offered concealment from any casual observer. Thomas struck a match and held it deliberately above the parapet, knowing that the light would draw the attention of enemy snipers, who had been trained to shoot at any illumination in the British lines. The flame danced in the night air for several seconds before the inevitable shot rang out. The bullet struck his hand with precisely the force he had calculated, causing immediate agony, but avoiding any damage that might prove permanently crippling. As he fell back into the trench, clutching his wounded hand against his chest, His whispered words were barely audible above the constant background noise of war. Thank you for my deliverance. The wound would take him back to England, back to safety, back to the possibility of survival in a conflict that had already claimed too many lives. It was a coward's escape, perhaps, but it was also a form of intelligence that recognized the difference between meaningful sacrifice and pointless waste. As Thomas lay in the mud of the Western Front, bleeding from a self-inflicted wound that represented his ticket to safety, the great machine of war ground onward through the darkness. Somewhere in England, a young woman prepared to begin her career as a nurse. Somewhere else, a man who had sacrificed his happiness to protect others climbed into a railway carriage that would carry him back to a life he had never wanted. And in the great houses and humble cottages scattered across the countryside, families waited for news that might never come, holding on to hope that seemed more fragile with each passing day. The war had transformed everything: relationships, expectations, the very fabric of society itself. And as the first episode of this new chapter in Downton's history drew to its close, all the certainties that had once seemed eternal lay in ruins, replaced by questions that no one yet knew how to answer.